Elena Rivera was not the kind of woman who backed down from a challenge, but the gym had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could leave the chaos of the outside world behind. A former national karate champion, she had spent years refining her skills, turning her body into a weapon and her mind into a fortress. But here, in this old, dimly lit fighters' club on the outskirts of town, she could just be another face in the crowd, training in anonymity. She liked it that way. No expectations, no pressure, just the sound of heavy bags thudding and the rhythm of her own breathing as she pushed herself harder each day. Her routine had been the same for months. Arrive at sunset, warm up in the corner, and spend the evening in focused training before heading home to her quiet apartment. She didn't socialize much with the others, but there was a quiet camaraderie among the regulars, a shared respect for the grind. That was, until the bikers showed up. They came roaring into the gym's gravel parking lot one night on their black and chrome machines, the roar of engines shattering the usual quiet hum of the neighborhood. Elena glanced up from wrapping her hands, her brow furrowing as the group of 6 strode in like they owned the place. At the head of the pack was their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a menacing swagger. His leather vest was adorned with patches, one of them reading Duke in bold, stitched letters. The energy in the gym shifted instantly. Conversations died, and even the sound of punches against the heavy bags seemed to soften as the group made their entrance. Duke's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the fighters, as if measuring each one. His gaze stopped on Elena. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny, though her muscles tightened instinctively. She'd seen men like him before, the kind who thrived on intimidation, who fed off fear. Duke smirked and nudged the guy next to him, a wiry man with a scar running down his jawline. "Looks like we've got some competition here," he said, his voice a low growl that carried across the room. Elena ignored him, finishing her wraps and moving toward the heavy bag in the corner. She'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with provocations like this was to stay focused. People like Duke wanted a reaction. She wouldn't give him one. But Duke wasn't the type to let things go. He strolled over, his boots heavy against the gym floor, and leaned casually against the bag she was about to use. "You got a name, sweetheart?" he asked, his tone mockingly friendly. "Elena," she said curtly, not looking up. "Elena," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "Well, Elena, I'm Duke. And this here's my crew. We're new around here. Figured we'd come check out the local talent." His crew chuckled, a low, grating sound that made Elena's skin crawl. She didn't respond, instead throwing a sharp jab at the bag. Duke watched, unimpressed, and then stepped closer, holding the bag steady as if to help. "You've got decent form," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I can show you a thing or two if you want to step in the ring." Elena stopped mid-punch, her dark eyes locking with his. "I'm fine, thanks," she said evenly. Duke chuckled and let go of the bag, stepping back with a mock surrender. All right. Don't say I didn't offer." He turned and walked back to his crew, who had started commandeering the weight benches and swapping out music on the gym's old stereo system for blaring rock. Elena tried to focus on her training, but the disruption was impossible to ignore. The bikers were loud, crude, and seemingly intent on making their presence known. As the night wore on, Elena noticed them watching her, their glances lingering a little too long, their laughter growing louder whenever she passed. She didn't like it, but she refused to let them see her discomfort. Instead, she finished her session, grabbed her bag, and left without a word. The next night they were back. This time they weren't just watching, they were interfering. One of Duke's men had accidentally bumped into her during her workout, knocking her off balance. Another had taken over the bench she was using without so much as a glance in her direction. Duke, meanwhile, seemed to delight in taunting her from a distance, making comments loud enough for her to hear but vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. By the end of the week, it was clear the bikers weren't just passing through. They had decided this gym was theirs now, and Duke had decided Elena was his next target. Elena considered switching gyms, but the thought made her stomach turn. Why should she have to give up her sanctuary because of a group of overgrown bullies? No, she wouldn't run. She had faced worse than this before. If Duke and his crew thought they could intimidate her, they were in for a surprise. The following evening, she arrived at the gym earlier than usual, hoping to get some training in before the bikers showed up. But as she stepped inside, she froze. The gym was empty except for Duke, who was leaning against the ring ropes, his arms crossed and a predatory smile on his face. "Hey there, Elena," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "Thought I'd get in a little private session tonight. Just you and me." Elena's heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral. "Not interested," she said, turning to leave. "Oh, come on," Duke called after her. "Don't be like that. I've been real patient, you know. Figured I'd let you settle in before we had a little friendly sparring match. But you're making it real hard to stay polite." She stopped and turned to face him, her jaw tight. "Polite isn't the word I'd use for what you've been doing." Duke laughed, a low, guttural sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far. Sooner or later, you're going to have to show me what you're made of." Elena took a step closer, her voice steady. "You don't scare me, Duke." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or respect. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual smirk. "We'll see about that," he said, climbing into the ring. "Anytime you're ready, sweetheart." Elena didn't respond. She turned and walked out, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. Duke and his crew were a threat to everyone in the gym, and she wasn't going to let them take over without a fight. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. The following week brought no relief to Elena. The bikers had become a permanent fixture at the gym, their presence like a dark cloud hanging over the place. Other gym members, once friendly and eager to offer advice or share tips, now kept their heads down and avoided eye contact whenever Duke and his crew were around. Even the staff seemed intimidated, their usual cheerful demeanor replaced by strained politeness and thinly veiled fear. Elena noticed the shift immediately. The energy in the gym, which had once fueled her training sessions, now felt oppressive, stifling her focus and leaving her on edge. She didn't like it. And what she liked even less was how Duke seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. At first, his taunts had been confined to snide comments and smug grins, subtle enough to be dismissed as harmless banter. But now they were escalating. One evening, as she was shadowboxing near the mirrors, she noticed Duke and two of his men standing nearby, watching her with barely concealed smirks. She ignored them, her fists flying in controlled arcs, her movements sharp and precise. "Nice moves," Duke drawled, loud enough for her to hear. "But you're telegraphing your punches." Anyone with half a brain could see that hook coming from a mile away. Elena didn't stop. She didn't even glance in his direction. "Hey," he continued, his tone mockingly cheerful. "I'm trying to help you out here. Don't be rude." Still, she said nothing. The air between them crackled with tension as Duke's smirk faded into a scowl. He took a step closer, his boots heavy against the gym floor. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," he said, his voice lower now, more menacing. Elena finally paused, her fists lowering as she turned to face him. Her expression was calm, her dark eyes steady. If I wanted advice, she said evenly, I'd ask someone who knew what they were talking about. The gym went silent. Duke's crew exchanged glances, their grins widening as if anticipating a show. Duke himself let out a short, humorless laugh, his hands resting on his hips. "You've got a mouth on you," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But let me give you a little piece of advice. You don't want to make an enemy out of me." "I'm not looking for enemies," Elena replied, her tone clipped. "But I'm not looking for friends either." She turned back to the mirror, resuming her shadowboxing as if the conversation had never happened. Behind her, she could feel Duke's glare boring into her back, but she didn't falter. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd rattled her. Later that night, as she was packing up her gear, she noticed something strange. Her gym bag, which she always left in the same spot near the lockers, was missing. Frowning, she glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the rows of benches and hooks. It was nowhere to be seen. Elena, one of the staff members, called from behind the counter, holding up a familiar-looking bag. "Is this yours? Someone left it outside near the dumpsters." Elena's stomach twisted as she walked over to retrieve it. The bag was damp, the zipper slightly torn, and when she opened it, she found that her belongings had been rifled through. Her gloves, hand wraps, and water bottle were still there, but her phone, which she always tucked into the side pocket, was gone. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind this, but she had no proof. Clutching the damaged bag to her chest, she muttered a quiet thanks to the staff member and left the gym, her mind racing. The parking lot was dark and nearly empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Elena's car was parked in its usual spot near the entrance, but as she approached, she noticed something that made her heart sink. The driver's side window was shattered, glass littering the ground like shards of ice. Her first instinct was to look inside, and sure enough, the glove compartment was open, its contents strewn across the seats. Her registration papers and insurance card were missing, along with a small envelope of cash she kept for emergencies. Anger flared in her chest, hot and sharp. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an invasion, a violation. She clenched her fists, her breath coming in short, angry bursts as she surveyed the damage. "Elena." The voice was low, familiar. She turned to see Duke leaning casually against his motorcycle, parked a few spaces away. His crew was scattered nearby, some perched on their bikes, others smoking and chatting as if this were just another ordinary evening. "Looks like someone's got it out for you," Duke said, his tone laced with mock sympathy. "Shame about your car." Elena's eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny?" He shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just saying, maybe you should be more careful. The world's a dangerous place." Her fists tightened at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to lash out, to wipe that smug grin off his face, but she knew that's exactly what he wanted. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "You think you can scare me," she said, her gaze locking with his. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Duke's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he laughed. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And trust me, sweetheart, this is just the beginning." Elena responded. She turned on her heel and walked to her car, carefully avoiding the shards of glass as she climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door. She couldn't drive it in this condition, but she wouldn't let them see her hesitate. She called for a tow truck, her voice calm and controlled despite the storm raging inside her. When she got home that night, she found another unpleasant surprise waiting for her. An envelope had been shoved under her apartment door, its edges crumpled and dirty. Inside was a single piece of paper, printed with a photo of her sparring at the gym. Scrawled across it in red ink were the words, "Next time, we won't miss." Elena stared at the note, her heart pounding. They had followed her. They knew where she lived. For the first time in years, fear crept into her chest, coiling tight around her lungs. She sat down on the edge of her bed, the note crumpled in her trembling hands. She thought of calling the police, but what could she say? She had no proof, no witnesses, and she knew Duke would deny everything if confronted. Instead, she reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't called in months. Her finger hovered over it for a moment before she pressed it, bringing the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Elena?" "Rafael," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough for her to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Then his voice came through, calm and resolute. "I'll be there in an hour." She hung up, exhaling slowly as she set the phone down. Rafael had always been her protector, even when she didn't want him to be. A former Recon Marine, he had a way of handling situations with precision and efficiency, but he wasn't the type to ask questions or offer reassurances. He dealt with problems head-on, and she knew this would be no exception. When he arrived, dressed in a worn leather jacket and combat boots, he took one look at her and frowned. "What happened?" Elena handed him the crumpled note, watching as his jaw tightened and his eyes darkened. He didn't say anything at first, just folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "You know who did this?" he asked. She nodded. "A group at the gym. They've been harassing me for weeks." Raphael's expression hardened. "They followed you home." "Looks like it." He nodded once, his posture stiff and controlled. "All right," he said, his voice calm but cold. "We'll take care of it." Elena wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Raphael had a way of turning problems into solutions, and she knew better than to question his methods. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. Duke and his crew had crossed a line, and Rafael wasn't the type to let something like that slide. She didn't know what he had planned, but one thing was certain: the bikers had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Rafael didn't waste any time. By the next morning he had already mapped out a plan in his head, the kind of meticulous strategy he had perfected during his years as a Recon Marine. To Elena, he seemed calm, too calm. He asked her pointed questions about Duke and his crew, how many were there, their usual behavior at the gym, any specific routines or patterns she had noticed. His voice was low, steady, but his eyes held a cold, calculating intensity that Elena hadn't seen in years. She had always known her brother could be intimidating, but this was different. Rafael insisted on accompanying her to the gym that evening, though she protested at first. "I can handle this, Rafa," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "If they see you with me, it'll just make things worse." He shook his head, unfazed. "They already crossed the line when they followed you home. This isn't about avoiding trouble anymore, it's about showing them they picked the wrong target." Elena sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing. Rafael wasn't the type to back down once he'd made up his mind. Still, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as they arrived at the gym. The parking lot was busier than usual, cars and motorcycles scattered across the gravel in uneven rows. The familiar rumble of engines filled the air, a low, menacing hum that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck stand on end. Duke's bike was parked front and center, as if staking his claim on the space. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken hostility. Duke and his crew were gathered near the weight benches, their laughter echoing through the room as they joked and jeered at one another. Other gym goers kept their distance, their gazes averted as they went about their routines in near silence. Elena felt every muscle in her body tighten as she stepped inside, Raphael following a step behind her. His presence was subtle but deliberate, a silent warning to anyone who might be watching. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the bikers, but his eyes swept the room with a sharpness that didn't go unnoticed. It didn't take long for Duke to notice them. He leaned back against the bench he was sitting on, his lips curling into a slow, predatory smile as he locked eyes with Elena. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Looks like the princess brought her knight in shining armor. The other bikers laughed, their voices a grating chorus that grated on Elena's nerves. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. Raphael stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I'm her brother," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And I think we need to have a conversation." Duke raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? And what would we have to talk about, big guy?" "Your behavior," Raphael said bluntly. "Following her home, damaging her property, harassing her in the gym. It stops now." The room went silent, the tension palpable as Duke's smirk faded. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and took a step closer to Raphael, sizing him up. The two men stood nearly eye to eye, their stances mirroring each other in an unspoken challenge. "You've got some nerve coming in here and making demands," Duke said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Raphael replied evenly. "And I'm giving you one chance to walk away before things get worse for you." Duke laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed through the gym. "You think you can scare me, Marine? I've dealt with tougher men than you." Raphael's eyes narrowed, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Is that so?" Before Duke could respond, one of his men, a wiry, scar-faced biker named Roach, stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Maybe we should show this guy what happens when you mess with us," he sneered. Raphael didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly, his gaze flicking to Roach with the precision of a predator assessing its prey. "You really want to do this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. For a moment, Roach hesitated, his bravado faltering under Raphael's piercing stare. But Duke's voice broke the silence, his tone sharp and commanding. "Stand down, Roach." Roach scowled but obeyed, stepping back with a reluctant shrug. Duke's eyes never left Raphael's, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," Duke said finally. "But you don't know what you're getting yourself into. This isn't your fight, Marine. Walk away while you still can." Raphael didn't move. "This became my fight the moment you threatened my sister. I'm not going anywhere." The standoff lasted a few more seconds before Duke let out a low growl, turning away with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Fine," he said, his tone laced with mock indifference. "Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you." As Duke and his crew returned to their corner, Raphael placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's get to work," he said quietly. Elena nodded, though her stomach was still in knots. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. The bikers continued to haunt the gym, their presence a constant reminder of the growing tension. Raphael accompanied Elena to every session, his watchful gaze never straying far from her. She hated the feeling of being under surveillance, but she couldn't deny the comfort his presence brought. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. Elena had just finished a grueling session on the heavy bag when she noticed something out of place. Her gloves, which she had left on the bench while she took a water break, were gone. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Roach, who was twirling one of the gloves in his hand with a smug grin. "Looking for these?" he called out, holding them up for her to see. Elena's jaw tightened as she marched over, her patience finally wearing thin. "Give them back," she demanded, her voice steady but laced with anger. Roach chuckled, tossing the gloves back and forth between his hands like a game. "Come and get them," he taunted. Before she could respond, Raphael appeared at her side, his expression dark. "You heard her," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Give them back." Roach hesitated, glancing at Duke for guidance. Duke, who had been watching the exchange with amusement, gave a slight nod. Reluctantly, Roach tossed the gloves onto the floor at Elena's feet. "There you go, princess," he sneered. "Didn't mean to upset you." Elena didn't dignify him with a response. She picked up the gloves and turned away, her hands trembling with suppressed rage. But as she walked back to her corner, she heard Duke's voice call out behind her. "You're going to have to stand up for yourself sooner or later, sweetheart. Or are you always going to let Big Brother fight your battles?" Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "You want me to stand up for myself?" she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Fine. Step in the ring." A murmur rippled through the gym as Duke's smirk widened. "You sure about that?" he asked, his tone mockingly sweet. Elena nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure." The room seemed to hold its breath as Duke climbed into the ring, his movements slow and deliberate. Elena followed, her fists clenched at her sides. Raphael watched from the sidelines, his jaw tight with concern. The fight was quick, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Elena moved with a precision and speed that left Duke struggling to keep up. Her punches landed with a force that belied her size, each one driving him further back. But Duke was no amateur. He fought dirty, throwing elbows and low kicks whenever he saw an opening. At one point, he grabbed her by the wrist, twisting hard enough to make her wince. Raphael was on his feet in an instant, his fists clenched, but Elena shot him a look that stopped him in his tracks. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. With a burst of strength, she broke free from Duke's grip, delivering a sharp uppercut that sent him staggering. She didn't let up, following with a flurry of punches that left him dazed and bleeding. Finally, he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Elena stood over him, her chest heaving, but she didn't move to deliver the final blow. Instead, she stepped back, her voice steady and cold. "We're done here." Duke glared up at her, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. Elena didn't respond. She climbed out of the ring, her head held high, and walked toward Raphael. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and concern. But even as they left the gym, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Duke's words weren't just an empty threat. This was far from over, and she knew it. The next morning began in an uneasy quiet. The events of the previous night lingered heavily in Elena's mind as she sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The fight with Duke had been a defining moment. She had proven she wasn't someone to be pushed around. But the venom in his voice as he spat out, "This isn't over," echoed in her ears like a warning. Duke wasn't the type to let things go, and she knew it. Across the table, Raphael sat silently, his phone in one hand and a notepad in the other. He had been up early, jotting down observations and making calls to contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. His military instincts had fully kicked in, and Elena recognized the look in his eyes, calm, calculated, ready for action. "We need to talk about next steps," he said, breaking the silence. Elena looked up from her coffee, her jaw tightening. "What's there to talk about?" "I handled him," Raphael frowned, setting his notepad down. You handled him last night, but this isn't just about Duke. He's not acting alone. These guys are organized, and they've already crossed the line multiple times. You think they're just going to back off now? She wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Duke's crew wasn't just a group of rowdy troublemakers, they were something darker, something more deliberate. The way they had targeted her, the way they had followed her home and sent her that note, it all pointed to a larger plan, something more insidious than simple intimidation. What are you thinking? She asked reluctantly. Raphael leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. We need information. These guys aren't just bikers, they're tied to something bigger. I've seen this kind of setup before: extortion, illegal fights, drug running. If we figure out who they're working for and what they want, we'll have leverage. Until then, we're just reacting to their moves. Elena nodded slowly, though a pit of unease settled in her stomach. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, even Raphael. But she also knew she couldn't face this alone. Later that day, Raphael insisted on driving her to the gym. She protested at first. She hated the idea of looking weak in front of Duke and his crew, but Raphael was adamant. This isn't about pride, Elena, he said. It's about safety. If something happens, I need to be there. When they arrived, the gym was unusually quiet. The usual hum of activity was muted, and several regulars were absent. Elena's eyes immediately scanned the room, searching for Duke and his men. To her surprise, they were nowhere to be seen. Stay sharp, Raphael murmured as they walked inside. This doesn't feel right. Elena nodded, though a flicker of relief crossed her mind. Maybe Duke had finally gotten the message. Maybe he and his crew had decided to move on. But as the evening went on, her relief turned to suspicion. The gym felt off, like it was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even though no one seemed to be paying her any attention. Raphael stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning the room, but even he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. It wasn't until they left that they found their answer. As they stepped into the parking lot, Elena froze. Her car, which had already suffered a shattered window days earlier, was now completely trashed. The tires were slashed, the hood was dented in multiple places, and the word payback was spray painted across the windshield in bold, dripping letters. Raphael cursed under his breath, his hand instinctively going to his pocket where he kept a small utility knife. Elena's face burned with anger as she stared at the damage, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. That son of a... Elena, Raphael interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Get in my truck, now. She turned to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't just angry, he was on high alert, his body tense and ready for action. Reluctantly, she climbed into the passenger seat of his truck as he pulled out his phone and took a series of photos of the damage. As they drove away, Raphael was silent, his jaw set and his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Finally, he spoke. This is escalating faster than I thought. They're not just trying to scare you, they're trying to provoke you. Well, it's working, Elena snapped. I'm ready to tear them apart. That's what they want, Raphael said sharply. They want you angry, reckless. They want you to make a mistake so they can control the situation. You need to stay calm. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. So what do we do? Raphael didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies. Finally, he said, we're going to hit back, but we're going to do it on our terms. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Raphael reached out to old contacts, former military buddies, local law enforcement officers, even a few names he refused to explain. Elena trained harder than ever, pouring her frustration into every punch and kick, sharpening her skills to a razor's edge. Meanwhile, Raphael's investigation began to bear fruit. Using a combination of online research and his network of contacts, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Duke and his crew weren't just random troublemakers. They were part of a larger organization that operated under the radar, using gyms and fight clubs as fronts for illegal activities. They're running an underground fight circuit, Raphael explained one evening, spreading a series of documents and photos across the kitchen table. High-stakes bets, unregulated fights, and a lot of dirty money. Duke's crew is one of several groups they use to recruit fighters and enforce their rules. Elena stared at the papers, her stomach churning. And they think I'm a potential recruit. More like a potential problem, Raphael said grimly. You're not playing by their rules and they don't like that. If they can't recruit you, they'll try to neutralize you. The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had thought this was just a personal vendetta, a battle between her and Duke. But now she realized it was something much bigger and far more dangerous. A few nights later, Raphael put the next phase of his plan into action. He had managed to track down the location of one of Duke's gatherings, a warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the crew held their underground fights. It was a risky move, but Raphael was determined to gather intel and, if possible, send a message. Elena, you're staying here, he said firmly as he prepared to leave. The hell I am, she shot back, crossing her arms. This isn't up for debate, Raphael said, his tone leaving no room for argument. This isn't a controlled environment like the gym. If something goes wrong, I need to know you're safe. Elena glared at him, but she knew he was right. Reluctantly, she nodded, though every fiber of her being ached to join him. Raphael arrived at the warehouse just after midnight, parking his truck a few blocks away and approaching on foot. The building was dilapidated, its windows covered with grime and its walls tagged with graffiti. The low thrum of bass music vibrated through the air, and the faint sound of cheering could be heard from inside. He slipped through a side entrance, moving silently as he took in the scene. The main floor was packed with people, a mix of rough-looking bikers, shady businessmen, and spectators shouting as two fighters slugged it out in a makeshift ring. Money changed hands rapidly, the crowd roaring with each blow. Raphael's eyes scanned the room, searching for familiar faces. It didn't take long to spot Duke, standing near the ring with a cigar in one hand and a stack of cash in the other. He was laughing, his voice carrying over the noise as he barked orders to his crew. Raphael's jaw tightened as he watched, his mind racing. He needed evidence, something he could use to expose the operation and bring it down. But as he moved closer, careful to stay out of sight, he realized there was more at stake than he had anticipated. In the corner of the room, he saw a young fighter barely out of his teens being dragged toward the ring by two of Duke's men. The kid looked terrified, his eyes wide and his body trembling as he struggled against their grip. Raphael's fists clenched. This wasn't just a fight, it was exploitation, plain and simple. He had seen enough. Slipping back out the way he came, he pulled out his phone and began sending messages to his contacts. It was time to bring the fight to Duke and his crew, but this time they wouldn't see it coming. Back at Elena's apartment, he laid out the plan. We're going to shut them down, he said, his voice firm. But we're going to do it smart. No more reacting, no more letting them control the narrative. We take the fight to them, and we end this. Elena nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were fighting back. and Duke had no idea what was about to hit him. Raphael's plan began to take shape with the kind of precision only a military mind could execute. The calm, analytical demeanor he displayed masked the storm brewing inside him. He wasn't just protecting Elena anymore, he was taking the fight directly to Duke and his network, turning their own tactics against them. The first step was to ensure that Elena remained out of harm's way. Though she protested vehemently, insisting that she could hold her own, Raphael was firm. "This isn't a fair fight, Elena," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "These guys don't play by the rules. If you step in now, you'll just give them another target. Let me handle this." Elena reluctantly agreed, though the frustration was evident in her clenched jaw and tense posture. She knew Raphael was right, but the idea of sitting on the sidelines while he faced danger alone felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Still, she trusted him, and for now, that would have to be enough. Raphael's next move was to establish surveillance on Duke's crew. He spent hours staking out the gym and the surrounding area, carefully observing their movements and routines. Duke's men were predictable in their arrogance, confident that no one would dare to challenge them. They came and went at odd hours, often gathering late at night to plan whatever illicit activities they were involved in. Raphael made note of every detail: their numbers, the vehicles they used, even the routes they took to and from the gym. One night, as he sat in his truck parked down the street, he noticed something unusual. A black SUV pulled into the gym's lot, its windows heavily tinted. It wasn't one of the bikes or battered trucks Duke's crew typically used. Raphael watched as two men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits that looked out of place in the gritty surroundings. They carried themselves with an air of authority, their movements deliberate and controlled. The men entered the gym, and though Raphael couldn't hear what was being said, he could see through the windows that the atmosphere inside had shifted. Duke, usually so loud and boisterous, stood stiffly as one of the men spoke to him, his expression tight. Whatever was happening, it was clear that these men weren't just customers or new recruits. They were something else entirely, something bigger. Raphael's instincts kicked into overdrive. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos of the SUV and the men as they exited the gym about 20 minutes later. They didn't linger, climbing back into the vehicle and driving off without so much as a glance around the lot. That night, Raphael pored over the photos, searching for any identifying details. The SUV had no plates, and the men's faces were unfamiliar. But something about their demeanor struck a chord. These weren't small-time thugs like Duke and his crew. They were professionals, part of a larger operation. The next day, Raphael reached out to an old contact from his military days, someone with access to information that wasn't readily available to the public. He sent the photos along with a brief explanation, asking for anything his friend could find. While he waited for a response, Raphael continued laying the groundwork for his offensive. He gathered evidence: photos, videos, recordings of Duke's crew harassing gym goers and conducting their shady dealings. He made sure to remain unseen, moving like a shadow through the edges of their world, always one step ahead. But Duke wasn't sitting idle either. The gym's atmosphere grew darker with each passing day. The bikers became more aggressive, their taunts more pointed, their presence more oppressive. Raphael could see the fear in the eyes of the regulars who still showed up, and it fueled his determination to put an end to this once and for all. One evening, as Raphael prepared to leave the gym, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. The handwriting was scrawled and uneven, but the message was clear: "Stay out of it, Marine, or she pays the price." His blood ran cold as he crumpled the note in his hand. They weren't just threatening him anymore, they were targeting Elena. Raphael drove straight to her apartment, his mind racing. When he arrived, Elena was already on edge, pacing the living room with her phone in hand. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of relief and frustration. "They've been calling me," she said, holding up her phone. Blocked numbers, no voices, just silence. Rafael's jaw tightened as he held up the crumpled note. "They're trying to rattle us," he said. "But it's not going to work. If they want to play games, we'll play. And we'll win." The next phase of Rafael's plan involved making contact with someone inside Duke's crew, someone who might be willing to talk. It was a long shot, but Rafael knew from experience that every organization had its weak links. He had noticed one of Duke's younger recruits, a wiry kid named Vince, who seemed uneasy during their gatherings. He rarely spoke, often standing on the outskirts of the group, his eyes darting nervously. Rafael decided to test the waters. One evening, as Vince lingered outside the gym smoking a cigarette, Rafael approached him, his movements calm and unthreatening. "Hey," Rafael said, his voice low. Vince jumped slightly, his hand instinctively going to the knife clipped to his belt. But when he saw Rafael, he hesitated, his posture relaxing just a fraction. "What do you want?" Vince asked, his voice defensive. "I want to talk," Rafael said. "I've seen you around. You don't seem like the others." Vince narrowed his eyes. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Rafael admitted. "But I know fear when I see it. And I know you're in over your head." Vince's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Rafael took a step closer, his tone softening. "You don't have to do this. Whatever they've got on you, it's not worth it. You can get out." For a moment, Vince looked like he might say something. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his eyes flicked to the ground. But then, as if remembering something, he straightened and shook his head. "I can't," he muttered. "You don't understand." Before Rafael could press further, the sound of boots on gravel interrupted them. Duke and another biker stepped out of the gym, their eyes locking on the two men. "What's going on here?" Duke asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Nothing," Vince said quickly, stepping away from Rafael. "Just taking a smoke break." Duke's gaze lingered on Rafael, his lips curling into a sneer. "You've got a bad habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, mean." Rafael didn't flinch. "Just having a conversation," he said evenly. "Well, have it somewhere else," Duke said, his voice dropping into a growl. "You're on thin ice." Rafael held Duke's gaze for a moment before turning and walking away, his expression unreadable. But inside, his frustration simmered. Vince was a potential ally, but reaching him would be harder than he'd thought. The next morning, Rafael's military contact finally responded with information about the men in the SOV. They were linked to a larger criminal syndicate that operated across multiple states, using fight clubs as a front for money laundering, illegal gambling, and human trafficking. Duke's crew was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Rafael's suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't just about Elena or the gym. It was about dismantling an entire operation. That night, Rafael called Elena into the living room, spreading the documents across the coffee table. "This is what we're dealing with," he said, his voice grim. Elena's eyes widened as she scanned the files. "This is huge," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is," Rafael agreed. "But it's also their weakness. If we can expose this, we can take them down from the top." Elena looked up at him, her expression resolute. "What do you need me to do?" Rafael hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew the risks, but he also knew that Elena wouldn't stand by and do nothing. "We're going to bait them," he said. "And we're going to make them think they're in control. But when the time comes, we'll hit them where it hurts." Elena nodded, her jaw set. "Let's do it." Raphael smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Together they began to lay the final pieces of their plan, knowing that the coming confrontation would be their most dangerous yet. The night of the confrontation had a weight to it that neither Raphael nor Elena could ignore. Everything they'd worked for, the surveillance, the preparation, the careful chess moves to stay ahead of Duke and his crew, was about to come to a head. Raphael's plan was simple in theory but perilous in execution. Lure Duke and his crew into a false sense of control, expose the network behind them, and ensure they didn't have the chance to retaliate. The setting for the final act was an abandoned industrial warehouse on the edge of town, a place where shadows hung heavy and silence reigned. It wasn't Raphael's choice. Duke had set the location for what he thought would be a meeting to settle the score. What Duke didn't know was that Raphael had been one step ahead, planting cameras and microphones earlier in the week. He'd even arranged for a small, trusted team of ex-military contacts to position themselves discreetly outside, ready to intervene if things went south. Elena had insisted on coming. "If this is going to end, I need to be there," she'd said, her voice firm with determination. Raphael had argued, but in the end he relented. She was a part of this, whether he liked it or not. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed like a dark monolith against the night sky, its broken windows and rusted exterior adding to its foreboding presence. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of oil and decay. The space was vast and cavernous, with old machinery and shipping crates scattered like forgotten relics. Duke and his crew were already there, their motorcycles parked in a loose circle outside the entrance. The roar of engines died down as Raphael and Elena stepped out of the truck, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. Duke stood at the center of his men, a cigar clenched between his teeth and a smug grin plastered across his face. "Well, look who decided to show up," he drawled, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. "The Marine and the Princess. I was starting to think you'd chickened out." Raphael didn't respond immediately. He kept his expression neutral, his eyes scanning the group with practiced precision. There were 8 of them in total: Duke, his core crew, and a few newer recruits Raphael hadn't seen before. All of them exuded confidence, their postures relaxed but ready, their hands never straying far from their weapons. "We're here to settle this," Raphael said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let's get to it." Duke chuckled, tossing his cigar to the ground and grinding it under his boot. "Settle this? You really think you're in a position to make demands? You've been a thorn in my side for weeks, Marine, and I'm about done playing nice." He took a step closer, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the ground. "Here's how this is going to go. You're going to hand over any evidence you've got on me and my crew, and you're going to walk away. If you don't, well," he gestured to the men around him, their smirks widening. "Let's just say it won't end well for you." Elena stepped forward before Raphael could respond, her eyes blazing. "You really think you can scare us?" she said, her voice sharp and defiant. "We're not here to back down. We're here to end this." Duke's grin faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Big talk for someone who doesn't know what she's up against," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think you're tough because you got a few hits in at the gym? This isn't a sparring match, sweetheart. This is the real world." "I know exactly what this is," Elena shot back. "And I'm not afraid of you." The tension reached a breaking point. Duke's crew shifted uneasily, their hands moving toward the weapons holstered at their sides. Raphael's muscles tensed, his mind racing through contingency plans. He had counted on Duke's ego to drive him into a confrontation, but the situation was more volatile than he'd anticipated. "Enough," Raphael said, his voice cutting through the chaos. You want the evidence? Fine. But first, you're going to answer a few questions. Duke's eyes narrowed. What the hell are you talking about? You think we don't know what you're really involved in? Raphael continued, his tone steady and deliberate. This isn't just about you and your little crew. We know about the fight circuit, the trafficking, the money laundering. You're just a pawn in someone else's game. The mention of the larger network clearly struck a nerve. Duke's confident facade cracked, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his men. You don't know a damn thing, he growled. Don't I? Raphael said, taking a step closer. I know about the men in suits who've been meeting with you. I know about the fighters you've recruited and discarded when they were no longer useful. And I know that the people you're working for won't hesitate to throw you under the bus the second you're no longer useful to them. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of crickets outside the warehouse. Duke's men exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering. You're bluffing, Duke said finally, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Raphael smiled faintly. Am I? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black device. You recognize this? It's a remote trigger. One push of this button, and every piece of evidence we've collected gets sent to law enforcement and the press. Videos, photos, names, locations. Everything. Duke's face darkened, his hands curling into fists. You're lying. Try me, Raphael said, his voice cold. The standoff hung in the air like a held breath. Duke's men were visibly uneasy now, their confidence eroding under the weight of Raphael's words. Even Duke seemed shaken, though he tried to mask it with a sneer. You think you're so smart, he spat. You think you can just walk in here and play hero? You have no idea who you're messing with. Maybe, Raphael said. But I know one thing, your time is up. Before Duke could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. Raphael's team had activated the backup plan, ensuring that law enforcement arrived at the perfect moment. The bikers panicked, their bravado crumbling as they scrambled to mount their bikes or flee on foot. Duke barked orders, his voice frantic as he tried to regain control, but it was too late. Police vehicles screeched to a halt outside the warehouse, their lights casting harsh, flickering beams across the scene. Drop your weapons. An officer shouted through a loudspeaker. This is your only warning. Chaos erupted. Some of Duke's men surrendered immediately, dropping their weapons and raising their hands. Others tried to fight, but they were quickly overpowered by the officers who swarmed the area. Duke, however, wasn't ready to give up. He lunged toward Raphael, his fists swinging wildly. Raphael sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, countering with a precise strike to Duke's ribs that sent him staggering. Elena, standing nearby, saw an opening and acted on instinct. She stepped forward, delivering a swift kick to Duke's knee that sent him crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, Raphael pinned him, twisting his arm behind his back. It's over, Raphael said, his voice low and steady. Duke struggled, but he was no match for Raphael's strength and training. Moments later, officers moved in, cuffing Duke and hauling him to his feet. His furious gaze burned into Raphael and Elena as he was led away, but his words were lost in the cacophony of shouts and sirens. As the dust settled, Raphael turned to Elena, his expression softening. You okay? He asked. She nodded, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Yeah, I'm okay. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving them both exhausted but relieved. The operation had been a success not just in taking down Duke and his crew, but in exposing the larger network behind them. As they stood together in the warehouse, watching the chaos unfold around them, Elena felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. This wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could finally breathe. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation unraveled slowly, like the clearing smoke after a storm. The chaos that had consumed Elena and Raphael's lives for weeks was finally subsiding, leaving a quiet but profound sense of resolution. The bikers, including Duke, had been taken into custody, their illegal activities exposed by the evidence Raphael had meticulously collected. The law was finally catching up to the network behind the fight circuit, and the dominoes were beginning to fall. For the first time in days, Elena woke up to silence. The constant knot of tension in her chest had loosened, though her body still carried the aches of the battles she'd fought, both physical and emotional. Sitting at her small kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea, she replayed the events in her mind. The warehouse, the confrontation, the moment when she and Raphael had stood side by side against the odds, it all felt like a blur, yet every detail remained vivid. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She rose cautiously, though she knew who it would be. Opening the door, she found Raphael standing there, a faint smile on his face. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to the sleepless nights he'd endured. But there was also a calm about him, a sense of purpose fulfilled. "Morning," he said simply, stepping inside. Elena gestured toward the table, where an extra cup was already waiting. Raphael raised an eyebrow but didn't comment as he sat down, cradling the tea in his hands. "You did good last night," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but firm. Elena looked at him, her brow furrowing. "We did good," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Raphael shook his head. "You've had the strength all along, Elena. I just helped point it in the right direction." For a while they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared experiences settling between them. It was a bond forged in fire, one that neither of them had sought but both had needed. Later that day, Raphael drove Elena to the gym. It felt strange to return after everything that had happened, but Elena was determined to reclaim her sanctuary. The parking lot was quiet, the broken windows and graffiti-covered walls serving as reminders of the battles fought here. Inside, the gym felt different. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the space during Duke's reign was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. A few regulars greeted Elena with nods and smiles, their relief evident. One of the trainers, an older man named Miguel, approached her as she wrapped her hands. "Good to see you back," he said, his voice warm. Elena smiled faintly. "Good to be back." Miguel hesitated, then added, "You stood up for all of us, you know. Most of us didn't have the courage to fight back, but you made it possible for us to feel safe again." The words caught Elena off guard. She had acted out of necessity, out of a refusal to let fear dictate her life. But hearing Miguel's gratitude, she realized that her fight had been about more than just herself. After her workout, Elena found Raphael waiting near the entrance, his arms crossed as he leaned casually against the wall. "Ready to go?" he asked. She nodded. But as they stepped outside, a familiar voice called out to them. "Elena." Turning, she saw Vince, the young recruit who had seemed so uneasy within Duke's crew, standing a few feet away. He looked different now, less guarded, though his hands were stuffed nervously into his jacket pockets. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice hesitant but sincere, "for what you and your brother did. I didn't know how to get out of it. I thought I was stuck." Elena exchanged a glance with Raphael, who gave her a small nod. "You're out now," she said. "That's what matters." Vince nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. "If you ever need anything, just let me know. I owe you." As he walked away, Elena felt a flicker of hope. Not everyone had escaped the chaos unscathed, but some like Vince had found a way forward. In the weeks that followed, the pieces began to fall into place. The gym returned to its usual rhythm, its members slowly rebuilding the community that had been fractured by Duke's reign. Raphael's evidence had been instrumental in dismantling the larger network behind the fight circuit, and law enforcement continued to make arrests across the region. Elena threw herself back into her training with renewed focus. The fights she had endured had sharpened her resolve, pushing her to new heights both physically and mentally. She no longer saw herself as a victim or a survivor, she was a fighter in every sense of the word. Raphael, meanwhile, prepared to move on. He had stayed longer than he'd planned, but the time had been necessary. As much as he wanted to stay and ensure Elena was safe, he knew she didn't need his protection anymore. On his last night in town, they sat together on the rooftop of her apartment building, the city lights stretching out below them. Raphael handed her a small, worn medallion, the kind given to soldiers as tokens of camaraderie. "This belonged to a buddy of mine," he said quietly. He used to say it was a reminder that no matter how tough things got, we were never alone. "I think you've earned it." Elena turned the medallion over in her hands, her throat tightening. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words lingering between them. Finally, Raphael stood, his shadow long against the rooftop. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice steady. "You too," Elena replied. As he walked away, Elena felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Raphael had been her shield, her guiding force when the world seemed to collapse around her. But now she was ready to stand on her own. In the months that followed, Elena continued to grow both as a fighter and as a person. The scars left by Duke and his crew were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her sanctuary, her strength, and her sense of purpose. And as she stood in the center of the gym one evening, watching as the next generation of fighters honed their skills, she realized something. The fight wasn't just about winning. It was about resilience, about standing up for what mattered, and about finding the courage to face whatever came next. Elena had found that courage, and she knew, no matter what the future held, she would be ready.